Hello, everybody. Welcome to the beginning of week 5. I'm going to record 2 short lectures at the beginning of this week, finishing up ethics, and then begin talking about epistemology. The first thing I wanted to talk about this week, and hopefully you've had a chance to look at the reading, is thinking about virtue ethics, and in particular Aristotelian virtue ethics. Aristotle was the sort of originator of a virtue ethical approach to normative ethics in general. Here's a bust of Aristotle himself. Aristotle was an ancient Greek. He was the student of Plato, who wrote many of the dialogues. So we read the Euthyphro dialogue. And Aristotle is famous for actually being the teacher of Alexander the Great. Aristotle wrote extensively in philosophy. In many people's minds, he is sort of the greatest philosopher because he was so comprehensive in what he discussed. He had issues, and he was kind of a scientist. He talked about ethics. He talked about metaphysics and epistemology. He did it all in a certain sense. Aristotelianism in general also has been thoroughly influenced Western thought. It kind of got folded into Christian thought, actually, at a certain point in time by Sir Thomas Aquinas. Basically, Catholic religion, like sort of the metaphysics, the background sort of theory to a lot of Western thinking after the Middle Ages is thoroughly Aristotelian, which is interesting. If you would like to end up studying any more philosophy, I highly suggest studying Aristotle. All right, so what's virtue ethics? Well, when it comes to ethics as we've done it and been talking about it so far, in particular, the theories of deontology and utilitarianism, both of those theories focus on actions. They focus on whether or not people's actions are good or bad for certain, reasons, right? The consequentialist utilitarian says an action is good if it produces the best consequences, bad if it doesn't. A deontological approach says an action is good if it follows a certain kind of rule. That's a good rule, right? If it matches with a duty that a person has, if the person has an obligation to do a certain thing and they take that action, then that action is a good action for them to take. Actions are good or bad depending on whether or not they accord with whether or not they're right or wrong, and the right or wrong actions depend upon what duties or obligations we have to one another. Virtue ethics throws out discussion of whether or not actions are good or bad on the basis of some feature of the actions. Instead, virtue ethics focuses on persons, on whether or not a person, in a sense, is good or bad, and then kind of derives whether or not actions are good or bad on the basis of the kinds of actions that a person takes, whether or not a person is a good person or a bad person, and then how that person would act. We understand good actions in terms of whether or not they're the kinds of actions that a good person would take. So slightly different approach in general. And so let's begin there. Virtue ethics, the focus of virtue ethics is on character traits, right? So whether or not you're a good person or a bad person depends on the character traits that you have, the virtues and the vices that a person has. Virtues being good and vices being bad. The main aim of virtue ethics, sort of the thing that's morally most valuable and the thing that's worth pursuing, and the thing that kind of tells us, helps us understand what is good and what is bad, is what Aristotle calls eudaimonia, which in a word just means flourishing. And the central argument for virtue ethics, which I think is probably a pretty good one, it's interesting, it's called the function argument. And so we're just going to go through these 3 things here in this short little lecture. So what is eudaimonia? Well, think about what it is that's worth pursuing in life. So go back to the lecture on Kant that I gave when I went down that little rabbit hole, trying to like see like ask you like, well, why are you here? Why do you want that? Well, why do you want that? You can do the same thing, and at the bottom of that sort of questioning rabbit hole, right? So like we start with, why are you in this class? And the answer is, well, because you want to get a good grade so that your grade point average looks good. I ask you, why do you want to get a good grade point average? And you say, because you want to transfer to a good college or university. And from there, why do you want to do that? Well, in the end, you're going to end up saying something like, well, because I want to be happy, and happiness seems like the kind of thing that's worth pursuing. In the end, Aristotle kind of wants to say, yeah, that's right. Happiness is the thing that's worth pursuing in life. But there's a really interesting question then. So like, what exactly is happiness, right? This is the utilitarians, the hedonists think, oh, pleasure, certain kinds of pleasure, that's really what's worth pursuing in the end. Aristotle's not so sure. Aristotle thinks, well, pleasure is good and all. It kind of goes with a good life. A person that's living a good life is living a pleasurable life, but it's not the pleasure that's worth pursuing. In a sense, it's the living of the good life, right? It's like having this life that's full of good stuff. That's the thing that's really worth pursuing, and pleasure is something that's sort of a part of that kind of life. Aristotle thinks, pleasure is a good thing, but not a full and great life is not completely full of pleasure. Some things are hard, but accomplishments go with things that are hard. And living a really good full life involves working for the stuff that you get, and then taking pleasure in the fact that you've accomplished those things. So more than pleasure and more than sort of the feeling of happiness, Aristotle thinks that the thing that's worth pursuing in life is to live your life well, is to have a flourishing life, have a full life, a life complete with all of the good things that life has to offer. Now, if I ask you what is worth pursuing in life and you just say, well, living a good life, that's kind of obvious, right? There's nothing really much there that Aristotle has told us at this point. And I'm not going to go deep into exactly what Aristotle thinks is part of a good life, but it's kind of, it is sort of formulaically interesting to see like Aristotle's answer to what's worth living for, what's worth pursuing is different from the deontological approach and the utilitarian approach in, I think, an interesting way that, I don't know, to me it seems like it gets things a little bit more right, even though it seems rather formulaic. All right, moving on to the function argument. So there's a relation between eudaimonia and the function argument, and here we go. So what is the goal of being a human being? Like, what's the point? What's the purpose to life as a human being, or, and all that jazz? Well, according to Aristotle, the basic, obvious answer to that question, the goal of being a human being is to live a good life as a human being, to live well, to flourish in living a human life. Well, what goes into living a flourishing human life? Well, some of the obvious things, right? We can just sort of poll people. Like, what do you think would be, what would it be good to have? Like, what's a good life to have? Well, it's a life in which you have a good family that's, together and flourishing, and everybody's happy and nobody's, dying or running off doing things that they shouldn't be doing. Good life involves having a lot of friends, having a successful job, maybe, being happy most of the time, right? Not being depressed all the time. Having enough money to survive, to get by, to, enjoy some of the finer things, maybe. Having emotional stability, not, being a stress case or being anxious all the time, or, again, being depressed or sad too much. Having your health, That seems like something that goes into living a flourishing human life. And then probably something like having a lot of luck, right? Being rather lucky seems super desirable. It seems like the kind of thing that, you know, people that really are living great lives are people that somehow fall into good fortune. I mean, just on the first case, like, you know, being raised in the right way, getting lucky in having your the parents that you have, getting lucky in being certain kind of um, privilege, having a certain kind of privilege. It seems like people that have a certain kind of privilege tend to be able to flourish a little bit better, and it's, you know, kind of lucky in a certain sense to be one of those people. Now, question: how do we come to live flourishing lives? How do we get these things in our lives? How do we come to have the good stuff in life and become a flourishing person? Well, Aristotle thinks that um, what we need to do is figure out the character traits that um, allow us to lead us to having these things that are part of a good flourishing human life. We need to find these character traits, and we need to try and cultivate them and cultivate them in ourselves and in others in order to sort of help along the ability for us to flourish. And these character traits are going to be the virtues. Now, here's the function argument to sort of let's get this off and start thinking. So the aim, according to Aristotle, of a human being is to live a flourishing life. Well, let's take an analogy here to sort of understand how the virtues play into the human aim of living a flourishing life. And the analogy here is the sort of one that everyone uses because Aristotle used it. It's the purpose of a knife, right? So, you know, human purpose, live a flourishing life. Knife purpose, well, what is the purpose of a knife? What do we use knives for? Why are knives the way that they are? Well, knives, the purpose of a knife is obviously to cut. It's used to cut, and we use it to cut things, right? Now, insofar as the knife has a purpose, right, of cutting, a knife can be a good knife or it can be a bad knife. That is, the knife can cut well or the knife can cut poorly. And then the question is, well, okay, what is the difference? Like, what makes a knife good as a knife and what makes a knife bad as a knife? What makes a knife cut well? Well, the sort of obvious answer here is that a good knife is a sharp knife, right? A knife that is sharp cuts well, and so a knife that is sharp, the sharpness of the knife allows for the knife to be good at what the knife's purpose is. So being sharp makes a knife good as a knife. That is, being sharp is a virtue for a knife. It makes it good at its purpose. Now, this can be applied in the same way. This sort of way of reasoning can be applied in the same way to the human aim and understanding the purpose of a human life to live a flourishing life. So if the human aim is to flourish, to live a flourishing life, we can ask, well, how do we achieve it? In order to achieve a flourishing life, we need to live well. We need to do good. We need to do the right thing in the right way in each and every situation that we are in. So there's a good question. How are we going to do that? Well, we need to find and cultivate the character traits that will help us to achieve the abilities to do well in the situations that we find ourselves in. Human virtues basically are the traits that help us to function well in the pursuit of our purpose. So human virtue are those traits that help human beings to live well, whereas the vices are those traits that detract us from living well. And sort of a really basic example here that Aristotle gives is courage. And this will sort of be the kind of, you can extend this example to all sorts of things, but this is sort of one of the most useful examples for understanding what a virtue looks like. So courage is a virtue, according to Aristotle. A person that lives a good, flourishing life is a person that has courageous tendencies. That is, when they are confronted in a situation that calls for courage, they will act courageously. That's what a virtuous person does. That's how a virtuous person acts. And so, that's like they've got a good character trait, the character trait of courage, and then the action that they take is understood as a good action because it comes from their good character, right? Now, how do you get the character trait of courage? Well, the character trait of courage comes from setting up within yourself certain dispositions to act in certain ways, right? Coming to recognize how it is that you think you ought to act in certain situations. Now, what's that? Well, when you're confronted in a situation where there's a certain amount of, like fear or danger, you've got to choose to do the right thing in the moment. You've got to actually confront that fear or danger while respecting that, the thing is causing you fear and the thing probably is actually dangerous. Now, this basically gives us what we might think of as the golden mean with respect to courage. And this is Aristotle's sort of interesting insight. There's a difference between, or courage sort of exists on a spectrum, right? What it is to be courageous is to, in a sense, be confident in the face of fear and danger. But you don't want to have too much confidence or too little confidence. If you were to have too much confidence or too little confidence, you wouldn't really be courageous. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, I don't know. Let's take some really funny example. Like, who are the courageous people in the stories, in the lore, people in like the military or something. Let's take a really basic old account, like, medieval dragon slayer. You take a medieval knight and he's going off to slay the dragon. And here are the sort of, the three scenarios. Scenario one, the knight arrives at the cave where the dragon lives. He goes up to the cave. He sees the dragon breathing fire. It scares the pants off of him, and he runs away. Well, in that case, the idea is that he doesn't have the right amount of courage, right? He doesn't have the right amount of confidence in the activity, and so he is suffering from the vice of cowardice. His character is not, in such a way that he is courageous. Now, second case, upon seeing the dragon in the lair, the knight rushes in. He's not overcome by any kind of fear. He's really raring to go, and he's going to run right in and try to attack the dragon, and maybe get burnt to a crisp while trying. Well, what's going on there? Well, he's overconfident, right? In that case, the knight hasn't taken the correct precautions in recognizing the actual danger in the situation, in the scenario. And insofar as he's done that, he's also not acted courageously. He's acted in a rash manner, a manner that's, overconfident, overzealous, and not good in a certain sense. Especially, in that case, he didn't get lucky, right? If he had acted that way and gotten lucky, then it would have been a different sort of situation, right? We would say, oh, well, look at that guy, he's overconfident, but he just got lucky when he went in. He wouldn't have died, but it's not the case that he acted from a stable disposition of character, like internal to him. He just kind of flew off the handle and got lucky. All right, third situation, we've got the knight going up and checking out the lair, and then him realizing what needs to be done, right? He's slow and methodical. He comes to, form a plan. He recognizes the danger that the dragon poses. He tries to figure out how to defeat the dragon without, getting burnt to a crisp. and he recognizes the fear in himself of the danger of the situation, and then yet still acts from a place of confidence, but confidence in the knowledge that he knows what he has to do in order to do it. Now, of course, that incorporates a whole bunch of extra stuff into courage, and ultimately Aristotle thinks that, right, the virtuous person doesn't just have one character trait. They have all of the character traits at the same time in the golden mean. They're all kind of they're all balanced well together in order to work together, in order to do the right thing at the right time. And so Aristotle basically thinks that to truly be courageous, you've also got to have a lot of other really perfectly balanced character traits that are also virtues. You can't have imagine you're the right amount of you have the right amount of confidence, but you have some other lack of character, right? Like you don't have you're not just or something. You're immoral in some other way, maybe. Well, in that kind of case, you might be doing the wrong thing, even though you are perfectly confident in the right way. You're not overconfident or underconfident. All right, so hopefully that begins to give you a basic idea of what courage is supposed to be, and what the virtues are supposed to look like on an Aristotelian picture. Here's an example of a few other virtues that Aristotle kind of discusses. Right, so we've got justice and injustice. There's ways to go overboard with respect to punishment. If you don't punish someone, you haven't brought justice. But if you over punish someone, then you've caused them injustice, right? Licentiousness, temperance, and insensibility, right? This is like this is probably the most obvious case, right? When it comes to the Aristotelian golden mean, take over imbibing in any context, right? Overeating, over drinking, eating too much chocolate cake, right? Working out too much, maybe. These are good examples of things where the golden mean is the sort of perfect case. The golden mean is the virtuous state. It's the right state that you're trying to aim for, you're trying to get into, in order to help cultivate these character traits within yourself, so that you can live the flourishing life. If you eat too much, then you will gain weight. If you eat too little, then you will be too skinny, and in order to be strong enough to do the right kinds of things. So being temperate and being in the middle, eating the correct amount, is the right thing to do. It's the golden mean here. Same thing with I don't know, possibly like drinking. Like if you drink too much, you become drunk. If you drink too little, you're a teetotaler. Maybe you're just, you don't have very much fun. You're not a very fun person. But if you drink the right amount, you're right in the right place. Now, of course, Aristotle recognizes that different people have different limits and different, temperaments. I mean, and so he doesn't think that everything is going to be the same for everyone. Obviously, right? I mean, someone that's a LeBron James type that's really big and extremely athletic ought to eat more than a person that is smaller and not as athletic, or doesn't have to play as much basketball as LeBron James does. So there's a difference here for differences for different people, depending on kind of your already built out natural tendencies. But with respect to the things that we actually have some semblance of control over, Aristotle thinks that we ought to be attempting to cultivate these dispositions within ourselves in order to try and achieve the golden mean with respect to the actions that we take between excess and deficiency, right? And he thinks that if we can do that, if we can cultivate those character traits, then those character traits will help us to live a flourishing life, right? Because those character traits will help us to determine what it is that we should do in specific situations throughout our lives. And that ultimately then is how we relate the virtues back to the purpose of life, which is to live a flourishing life, according to Aristotle, right? If we're trying to live a flourishing life, then what we should do is cultivate the virtues, because cultivating the virtues allows us to act in the right ways in the situations that we are in, where, in order to act in the right ways, if you act in the right ways in the situations that you're in, that will lead you to live a generally flourishing life. So how should we live? According to Aristotle, again, we need to try and cultivate virtuous character traits in ourselves. We know, he thinks, for the most part, what character traits are good to cultivate, because they're the ones that are directly related to how it is that we live a good life. Now, of course, it's hard to motivate ourselves into cultivating these character traits, but he thinks that we should try. And in our day-to-day lives, we should act in this way, basically. If you're trying to sort of think like, oh, how should I act? How does Aristotle think I ought to try and act in every situation? Well, he thinks that in trying to act as the virtuous person would act in those situations, we can try to copy those people into cultivating the virtuous characters within ourselves. So basically, it's like, pick someone that you think is really good at something, right? Like, someone, if you think that you're not nice enough, right, and you think that being nice is something that really you ought to do in order to cultivate the virtue, right? You don't want to be too nice, but you don't want to be not nice enough, right? People that are too nice get walked all over, they're pushovers. People that aren't nice enough are, jerks, and people don't like them. So you want to be in that golden mean. Well, what are you supposed to do? Well, find somebody that you think is the perfect amount of nice, and try to act as they would act. Like, think of them as a person that has the virtue of niceness, and try to act as they would act. Aristotle basically thinks that that's a good way to try and become more virtuous. All right, that basically wraps this up. Here's a final little meme that's pretty funny. If you study more Aristotle, this would be a little bit more relevant and you'd understand it. But I think it's pretty funny who gets the last slice of cake, and it's going to be the best flute player. But yeah, so the next lecture will be on Singer's argument that we ought to, donate a lot more money than we do, and that will be the sort of end of our ethics section. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you liked this lecture. I think in comparison between virtue ethics, utilitarianism, and deontological approaches to ethics, like Kantianism, all of them get things right and get things a little bit wrong in certain ways. The Aristotelian approach is kind of, I think, the most helpful in a certain sense towards making us, directing our lives in a certain way. It's hard always to know from a deontological approach what obligations and duties you really have. From a utilitarian approach, it's really difficult to know what's actually going to create the most happiness in the world. And so it's not always easy to act along those lines either. But yeah, I mean, in the end, each of these views, you can hopefully see at this point, they're all kind of surrounding and aiming at the same kind of issue. They're trying to capture the same set of intuitions that each of us has about what's right and what's wrong. And sometimes, parts of the theory are good and parts of the theory are bad. And then the question is sort of like, well, which one gets these things the most right? Which one ought we to subscribe to sort of the most wholeheartedly? Which one should we build into our being in order to try and act the most in the way that's the most moral? And from that, I think, at the very least, continuing to study these theories is rather helpful and really good for attempting to cultivate a good and moral life in ourselves. All right, that'll be it for this lecture, and see you in the next one.